So I think AI is an invitation to reclaim our purpose, to reclaim our prominence, to get refocused on the larger question of how do we help learners become better human beings?
Welcome to Office Hours, where we host candid conversations for the new era of learning. I'm Marni Baker Stein, and today we're talking about one of the biggest questions facing higher education. Not whether AI belongs in learning, but what AI reveals about the model we've built. Universities have always stood for something larger than content delivery. At their best, they help people develop judgment and agency and purpose and confidence in who they're becoming. But too often, the system still organizes itself around courses and credits and assignments and credentials. AI is putting new pressure on that tension. It challenges higher education to be much more explicit about where human value lives and much more intentional about designing learning experiences around that value. That's why I'm so excited to be joined by Paul LeBlanc. Paul has spent his career expanding access, challenging inherited models, and pushing higher education to serve learners better. Few people have done more to push higher education to rethink who it serves, how it serves them, and what meaningful learning should make possible. Paul, welcome to the hot seat.
It's so great to be with you, Marty. Thank you for having me.
All right. So we're going to start with maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable question. If AI can deliver knowledge and tutoring and practice and contextualization and feedback at scale, what is the university still uniquely for, in your opinion?
Yeah, I love this question because I think what has happened with AI is that it has, in a very sobering way, held a mirror to our industry and shown that we've allowed ourselves to be rendered, to be reduced to, in some ways, and it's going to sound a little harsh, but a kind of expensive job training proposition, our industry. And one in which we, as you said, we're preoccupied with credentials and workforce alignment. I know those are important. We should come back to the question of work. But really, universities are about so much more. At least we want them to be about so much more. So I think AI is an invitation to reclaim our purpose, to reclaim our prominence, to get refocused on the larger question of how do we help learners become better human beings, however they define that for themselves, to be the best versions of themselves, and by extension, to make help society be better than it would be otherwise. So I have a book coming out, as you know, Marty, in July, and it's called Reclaiming Purpose, the University in an AI World. I think it's an exciting time, actually. I know the transition's hard. I know we have lots of fears and anxieties, but what a time to sort of get back to what we should be about.
So in a sense, like really what you're saying is there's all this hullabaloo about AI, but maybe right now we're not in a moment where we're facing a tool problem or a tool implementation problem. We're at a moment where we're facing a purpose problem.
It's a lovely way of framing this, especially if you think about we now possess a tool that's actually, I would argue, and this isn't science fiction, like now is able to do knowledge transfer better than many or most of the people we put in the classroom. If you are a faculty member, or if you're an institution for that matter, that think that your purpose is knowledge transfer, that's a dangerous place to be. If you are an institution who thinks that you are an intentionally curated community of learners in which faculty really bring a kind of magic of connection and relationship and help students be the best versions of themselves, sometimes that's cajoling, sometimes that's helping them dream bigger dreams for themselves. um, then I think you're well positioned. At least your framework is right for how to think about how we move forward in the world.
Yeah. So I love this. You talk a lot about moving from knowledge transfer to human transformation. I really love that soundbite from you, and I use it all the time. And but I'd like to hear from you, like in your mind, like what should students experience differently if a university is truly designed around transformation rather than transmission?
So I think the following things would be true of the university of the future, which one is I would feel like I matter to the place. Too many students move through our sector and they don't feel like they actually matter to anyone. In the first chapter of my book, Broken from 2022, is called Mattering. Um, so I think you can't what I learned in interviews with psychologists and sociologists and others is that you really can't transform a life if that person doesn't feel like they matter to you. And you is the university, but it can be even just the one mentor, one key mentor, right? We'd like to ideally think it would be everybody they engage in. Second is that the learning would feel very tuned to the student. So now we finally can grasp the holy grail of personalized learning. I go further, I like to call it precision learning, like N of one, to borrow a phrase from healthcare. And David Keel, who we both know from Civitas, who formerly of Civitas, uses this phrase. We can really make that learning feel right to you, like we know you. The way the best instructor, if you were engaged with them in a class, is sitting with you one-on-one, could make you feel. I think we would be very intentional. We would understand and feel like we were getting a sense both of our metacognition. We would be better about thinking about our own thinking, right? We would feel like we have a toolkit of ways of thinking about the world. I always liked, and look at a lot of these components you and I are talking about exist in the sector. So I think it was Alverno College that had a general education program that was essentially, if I have this right, so think like a scientist, think like an artist, think like a sociologist, right? Like these are ways of problem solving. And the more of those you have in your toolkit, the more you will be able to be resilient and face a kind of uncommon situations and new situations, et cetera, et cetera. Another would be that we'd be very intentional, the student and the institution, about our human skills, about our interpersonal skills. And we would be able to see that mapping. We would see our progress. We would be put in situations. And I'll stop. I won't make this list going forever. And we would learn by doing, and we would demonstrate our learn by doing. So I've been a long-standing champion of competency-based education, as have you, Marnie. And what we both know is that that requires performance-based assessments. It's not just what you know; it's what can you do with what you know, and can you demonstrate that? And in an AI world in which so we can almost know anything with our capable AI assistant that we will all have next to
Mhm.
us, what can I do with that? What can I do, right? And I love one of the ways I think about this is borrowed from David Autor at MIT, and I think of the future of education as being three buckets. So one will be our three legs of a stool, if you will. So the first leg will be if I'm going to be a healthcare worker or if I want to be in the arts or whatever field that I'm moving into, it'll be much less about a particular job because that's going to be very hard to predict. But it's going to be about thinking about the way that field requires, right? I'm going to have what he calls foundational knowledge. And in healthcare, it would be very concrete, like working with the embodied person, right? Literally, can you mend, put a cast on an arm and so on and so on. But in the arts, maybe frameworks are thinking about creativity and design and so on. The second leg of the stool would be our interpersonal human skills, so our effectiveness. And those would include, by the way, not just interpersonal, but things like, system thinking or design thinking or critical thinking is I think sometimes not as well defined as we need it to be, but let's call it critical thinking in there. Creativity, but also empathy, also sense making, also the ability to navigate cultures different than your own. And then so that's the second bucket, that big bucket of soft skills, human skills, and so on. And then the third bucket would be actually working with AI. Um,
Mhm.
Knowing how to use the tools, knowing how to use AI as a powerful extension of your own cognitive abilities, using AI to traverse systems, right, which is what it's really good at. And
Yeah.
that, and we will all have to be good at that. And maybe there's a time in the future where that's so built in at the right and appropriate stages of development that we wouldn't think of it as that necessary third leg. But at least for this next big transitional time, we're all going to have to learn to get really good at its use.
Yeah. I mean, as I'm listening to you, I'm hearing lots of great ideas or sort of focus areas for higher ed. And I'm sure that higher ed will start to pick some of these, or it already is. And we know that higher ed is like really good at putting like beautiful words on banners. Um, but how do we know this is real? Like, what does this end up looking like when it becomes real, when it actualizes? Like,
Yeah. So I assume it will take many forms because we talk about higher ed often we use that term very broadly, but as we both know, there are many forms of higher education and the experience of a residential college. I think families and students will very much want their 17-year-olds to have a kind of growing up experience and a very intentional community of peers and better than we have done. In other words, we'll start to measure what it means to help people grow up in that in that phase of their life. But also the learners that you and I have long worked with, which are working adults who have had all the coming of age they can handle, they need
Hmm.
something different. So it's going to look different in various places. So in some ways, I think what we will see is that we will democratize the sites of learning. In other words, learning will take place in many, many, many sites. So the residential campus will persist because it's important if you're an 18-year-old. Get out from under your parents' roof. But that's a small percentage of overall learners now. One's workplace can now become a place of learning, right? Virtual, of course, online will continue. And then I think it's really a question of how does it feel, right? So does it have that sense of, no, this place knows me. I'm connected. They get who I am holistically. They deliver my learning in ways that really are fine tuned to me. I think one of the things that we have to grapple with is if we're going to move, and this is like paradigm level change, if we're going to move from a one size fits all model of delivery, which is what we have today and have had for decades and decades and decades, um, the classroom is no longer a place of so much shared experience. At least the course and program is not. The outcomes will be shared. So institutions will have to think about where the common experiences happen. How does belonging happen? How does affinity belong? And I think there are probably three things, and now we'll get into the even more abstract, that institutions will have to account for. So one is I think we will ask of institutions to declare what their kind of value system is. What is their sort of moral framework or their values framework? Because helping people be better versions of themselves requires institutions to grapple with those questions. We have lots of schools that don't shy away from that. Jesuit colleges don't shy away from that. Military academies don't shy away from that. HBCUs don't shy away from that.
Right, right.
But it's going to be, I think, incumbent on all institutions. Another is that I think we will grapple with what it means to be embodied selves. One of the things that distinguishes us from artificial intelligence is our intelligence lives within a body. What does that mean? Like, I'm
Yeah.
not saying like we're going to have phys ed classes, but what does it mean to be in that space, right? And I think it is an invitation to revisit the arts, for example. In so many cultures around the world, dance is part of everyday life. In America, it's a thing you do at a party or you pay to go see, right? It's like, so
Yeah.
we'll start to think about, and then this is a phrase that I first heard from Noah Feldman at the Harvard Law School. And it's one that does not everyone's comfortable with, but I think we'll also talk about our unsold selves, which is, the Greeks would have called psyche and Christians would call your soul and Jung would call awe, right? But it's this notion that outside of our ego, we often connect in ways that we don't really very well understand. And what is that? What are these things that James Joyce called epiphanies? And it can be felt in religious experience, but it can be felt, a lot of people would say, in nature and lots of other places. And there's a wonderful recent essay in Harper's about this by an American poet who talks about the way quantum mechanics invites us into these weird spaces where we realize, like, our consciousness is complicated. And I know that starts to sound like a wavy fairy or something, like, what is that? What is this mumbo jumbo? But if you've experienced it, and most people I know have had versions of it. I had it when my two daughters were born, the first seconds that I held them, and I thought, God, like the universe is bigger and I feel connected in a way that is not every day. I also felt that at my mother's bedside when she passed away in those last moments, right? Where you felt like connected in the world differently. But people describe feeling this in concerts. Marnie, where you see like a performer rise, like you realize like, oh my God, there's something special going on here. But then the audiences rises up and then they feed off each other's energy. And
Yeah.
there's like the third space, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what I'd like to just connect that back to what you were talking about, sort of these different modalities for different moments in life and how critical they're going to remain in this future. And like, if I like, you know, beyond this sort of third space, sort of almost spiritual experience that you're
Yeah.
describing, I think what happens all the time for learners in learning and education is, you know, we have to create this almost flywheel for them where they become curious about something and then they that curiosity starts to roll into a sense of conviction about becoming someone or, you know, mastering something. And then that sense of conviction, rolls into this sense of connected a connection with something bigger than you, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that is a flywheel, and that is a flywheel that's important for every learner, not just learners in the coming of age experience, like not just learners who can afford to go to a 4-year university and have a wonderful. It's all humans need that. In fact, we may need that more when we're adults than we do when we're kids. Because when we're kids, we're expected to go to college and get curious about something, right? But when we're adults, it's like there's no time for that. Like, well, how do you think about that? And like, what role do you think AI can sort of play in like enabling that flywheel?
Yeah. So it's interesting you said something in passing about we expect to have it as kids. And I was talking to an educator recently, and I don't spend a lot of my time in K-12, but I'm drawn to it because I think a lot of what we're talking about should be nurtured along earlier than when we get people in post-secondary. And they said to me, you know, it's a very rare young person who comes out of high school more curious and creative than when they went into kindergarten.
Hmm.
And I thought, oh, that's kind of heartbreaking, but it felt true. I don't know, like, and then I was talking to Rick Weisbord, who is a colleague at Harvard at the Grad School of Ed. He has this really wonderful project going on about education and character development. And he said 80, like a recent survey of high schoolers, 80% of them say that a high priority for them is a life of purpose. And yet when you compare that to surveys of college graduates, are they leaving going into the world with a sense of purpose? It's again, the drop off is not good.
Right.
So it's an invitation to your point about how do we how do we how do we bring that to our students? How do we set the conditions for them to discover that? And yeah, so I think, there are a lot of motivations for why people enroll. So the ones that you and I love best are when we can help them find the intrinsic motivation, the thing that grabs their passion. And I think I think the key to that, and I could take this from Matt Beal at Georgetown, a good friend who's head of child and adolescent psychology, is we often want to impose that. And what we need to do is invite that.
Yes.
Because the thing that you drives you and me, Marnie, may not be the thing that drives so and so, right? So
Exactly.
helping them discover what that is. And the place that I love that where I think that does this magnificently is a high school in Providence, Rhode Island, founded by my idol of mine named Dennis Lipke. It's called the Metropolitan School, the Met for short. But the Met starts with the quiet. And so Dennis built a school in a crack neighborhood in South Providence where no one would go. And he said, I'll take the kids no one wants to take, but give me more leeway. And the question he always starts with is, what do you love? And the answer is never school. The answer is any other number of other things, right? And then that's the launch pad for how they develop that student's experience. So when I first went, the first time I went, the young woman who had been kicked out of 3 high schools and was going to be sent home to her grandparents' farm in Puerto Rico, which sounded like hell to her. This was her last shot, according to her parents. And when they asked her what she liked, she said, "Not school." She told me the story, so I've always held on to that phrase. So what do you like? She said, "Fish. I have a tropical aquarium. I like saltwater fish." So they got her work study experience at Woods Hole. She thought she'd gone to
Mm,
heaven.
mm,
And when they asked her to do things that she couldn't do because she didn't have the math, you know what she got really, really interested in? Math. She came back and said to her advisor, "I need to learn whatever it was, like percentages." Okay, we'll set you up, right? And now she had a driver. And I think this is your point, right? So, two things. How do we help people discover the drivers that move them most, that motivate them to learn? And then how do we give them that sense of belonging to other like learners, right? And I do think, like, how will IA assist in this? So, I think one, it's going to take away a lot of the time we spent on knowledge transfer so human beings can do this curation of community. When I think about the classroom of the future, so what does it look like? I think teachers become curators of community. I think classroom time, asynchronous time, if it's online, that's a close the laptop. Well, not if you're online, but that's if you're physically, that's a close the laptop moment. That's for us to be in group, right? In conversation, enrichment, bringing people in, uh, group projects where I get to work with you and we get to sort of go back and forth on a thing. And it's where we start to build connection. And the military has known this forever, right? Unit cohesion is a phrase from the military. And I learned this from a former chief staff who was an officer, much decorated, but also in the work that Marty Seligman did at West
Mm.
Point. And I love this little factoid that I've shared, which was when they brought, Marty Seligman is the Penn professor,
Oh,
father,
yeah,
one
I
of the
know
fathers.
Marty.
You know Marty, good. Well,
Yeah.
so they were interested in what is the number one trait of West Point cadets? Like, what is the psychological driver of someone who wants to go to West Point? And people think service and duty and all kinds of things. It's actually the capacity to love and be loved,
Mm.
right? And then this great phrase that your soldiers won't care what you know till they know that you care. And I think part of what we will want to do is find ways to bring students together so you start to get those relational bonds. And the ones that you and I and everyone I speak with, and I can tell you on average how many people have these teachers in their lives. The teachers that transformed our lives are the ones that made us feel like they cared about us, that they gave us their time, right? And the average, by the way, Marnie,
Yeah.
3. From kindergarten through college, I ask people, almost always
That's
3.
I to I totally and that kinda leads me to my next question, which is, like, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking, "Yeah, yeah, that's right, that's right." And then my second thing that I think is, but how do we do that at scale? You know? Because a lot of kids and adults for that matter are in environments where, I can't remember her name, the one who liked fish.
Yeah. I
Um,
don't remember, it was years ago.
yeah, the one who likes fish, like they don't get lucky enough to meet a moment where somebody even asks them that question and then starts putting together a line of inquiry and exploration for them that leads them to get curious about things like math that they never thought they would, right? That's the that's the dilemma, right? It's like a lot of environments that are set up to do that are small and intimate and therefore expensive, and inaccessible. And so I wonder what you feel about you describe this idea of a genius and these LLM powered kind of coaches or TAs or tutors or whatever you want. I mean, they are becoming truly legitimately genius coaches.
Amazing.
And so like and you know, that's all of a sudden they can support explanation, they can support practice, they can support remediation. I know we have surveyed lots of young people globally who are saying that these tutors, these AI, office hours that they now have access to are not only helping them to learn new concepts better, faster, more effectively, but they are building a confidence in studying in these pathways that they would have never had before. We talked to one young woman who was, like, very, afraid of economics and knew she had to take it for her degree requirement and just avoided it, kept dropping it. Finally has this AI tutor who becomes her always on office hours, and not only starts learning it because it's contextualizing it for her, but she gets so confident in economics that she's like, "Oh, I wanna take more courses in that direction," and it
Amazing.
opens up this whole new world of opportunity for her that otherwise would have been closed, because she just wouldn't have had access to someone who could sit down and be her companion in that way. So where do you think these genius TAs come in, and, like, can they help us problem solve the problem of scale, and what can't they help us with, you know?
Yeah, I love this. And you use language that I think is really important to sort of unpack and hold on to. So one is when you talked about like when they don't have. And I think a lot of our AI fears is about displacement, where we do have, but now we feel like AI will shove a human aside. That's not what you just described. We're describing students who don't feel like they have that. And we know that the those sort of, those iconic teachers that I evoked a few minutes ago The reality is people don't have a lot of them. If you're in a 600, 400, 300 student lecture hall, intro to whatever, you're having very little of that, maybe with the TA. So I always like to make a distinction when we're looking at deployment of AI. Is this a deployment that takes away an important human relationship, or that either augments or supplements or provides what isn't there? And for a lot of the world, including for chunks of learners in the US, it's not there. So I love what you described, and it's incredibly good. And then I think we have to think hard about the anthropomorphic seduction of those agents. Um, it's not yet clear what's healthy, what's not healthy. We know there are going to be companies that leverage it to get more use, but it may be to the detriment of human beings and society. We saw this with social media, what happens with engagement and what lengths people will go to. So we've been doing in my own team kind of review of the research, right? So we know warmth is really important. I also talked to an anthropologist at DeepMind who said to me, I would prohibit the use of the pronoun I. Oh, we know there are these expressions where agents will say things like, well, if it were me,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. And it makes us, the reality is, there is no me, there is no object I, right? But on the other hand, that casual conversational language is part of the warmth and part of the eases the engagement. And there was this wonderful example of one of our testers when we were working on the last platform, Outer Space, and she was, I assume, housing insecure because she said she was a single mom living in a motel with her 3 kids. And she said, and our agent was called Ellie. And she said, I hope this is okay, but when I finish my session with Ellie, I asked her to help me with my resume because I finally have a job interview and they said I have to bring a resume and I don't have one and I have no one to ask. So there's your point, right? Like we're
Yep.
not displaying this. She had no one to ask. And she said, Ellie did a great job. And at the end, she wished me luck and said she knew I was going to really knock it out of the park. And I thought, good for you, Ellie. Like we didn't train you to do that, but you helped her out. She left that session confident and with the tools she needs. And that's a little weird at the end. Right?
It's a
Like,
little,
all I'm
yeah. I
saying
mean,
is I like it. I just think we have to spend time really understanding it.
I totally agree. I mean, I'll say first, I think this, LLMs are really based for, they're designed for engagement, right? That's what they're designed for. Or at least those that are going after a consumer market are designed for engagement. Um, we need LLMs ultimately that are designed both for engagement and legitimate development, right? The mechanics of taking a person from A to B, whether it's developing a skill or writing a resume or understanding the importance of an opportunity, it's that mechanics is not necessarily natural to the way LLMs were developed, right? Because it's hard to get from A to B. There has to be productive struggle in that journey,
Exactly.
in most cases. And so getting that right with LLMs, is, I think, really critical in their use cases for education. And then,
Couldn't agree
and then
more.
the question of their affect, as they're doing it, like that's a highly personal thing as well.
Mm-hmm.
The
Culturally
no,
defined, right? Even culturally defined. Like, what does that
even
look like?
culturally,
That's cool.
or within families or
Yep.
within certain
Yep.
personalities, some people want a drill sergeant, and some people want a kindly, wizened mentor, and some people want a cheerleader, and so I think that's a really interesting point as well. Like it'll be fascinating to see where AI goes in the future in terms of the educational teaching, learning, development use case specifically, because they are not designed for that, even though they can do it and do it rather effectively sometimes.
Yeah.
They really are focused on extending that engagement, right?
100%. I think there are a couple of things in your comments that are really important to pull out. So one is that really, we know that genuine learning requires constructive struggle. Some people like the frictions become a very popular word. And what is the right amount? Too much and you lose a learner, too little and they're not actually learning. So a system that gets that calibrated. 100% agree that LLMs are not designed as learning agents. They give us a kind of easy initial facsimile, a surface level. But like when we started looking at the learning science, we know our teams will like unpack 82 pedagogical moves that need to be mastered within a good learning agent.
Hmm.
And that's just like on our first initial research, right? So like how you build that and what's the right intervention at the right time. When is it right not to intervene? Like, oh no, the student is in a flow
Right.
and don't touch it, right? Like teachers know this. Like if you're sitting with a student, you get that sense in a way that's very hard to replicate. So I think all that's true. And most importantly, and this is where like maybe the biggest immediate impact of AI, it's showing us the degree to which our forms of assessment are really inadequate and have been long before AI came along. And it's going to force us to get back to measuring and assessing actual learning. And when we do that, then you're going to have to see learning agents that really perform and just don't make it easy, that aren't sycophantic and just sort of letting you, and certainly not getting away with just getting a thing done, because getting a thing done is not learning or understanding it. So the biggest pressure I think right now, among outside of things like getting your data architecture right and so on, but for learning is you have to rethink assessment. That's our biggest immediate challenge.
I totally agree with that. And I'm wondering, like, as you're talking, I just want to, I do want to get to your book because I want to talk a little bit about that. But I was just wondering if we could just spend one final second talking about like what happens to that um, underserved, under-resourced student, that first generation student in this model, um, who who may be headed to a school where no matter how good their instructor is, their teacher, their faculty member, they're sitting in a class with 350, 500 other students. Are we potentially, with all of this, um, creating an even more tiered system where we have high touch human education for some learners and AI only support for others or no support for others? Like,
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's replicating or continuing a system that already exists. Some of our most selective and expensive schools in the country, institutions in the country, are small liberal arts colleges where you're going to be sitting at a seminar table and your instructor is going to know you and you're going to see each other in lots of classes. They're kind of the most beautiful learning possible, right? I love those institutions.
mhm,
Interestingly, they're often not the Ivy Leagues who sit at the very top. They give you something else. They give you
right.
status signals and a value added network and other things. Um, for the underserved learner, you raise such an interesting question because historically the inequity question has been underserved learners don't have the same technology. And now we're seeing this interesting flip where it might be underserved learners only get the technology and not enough of the
Yeah.
human. It's not a surprise that the executives of artificial intelligence companies send their kids to Montessori schools.
Yeah.
Like high touch, individual pathways, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to think very hard about where we bring human connection into the equation and not do what we do all the time in modern American capitalist society, which is to try to wean out as much of the human as possible because it's expensive and messy and hard to control and hard to measure. We almost have to, when I wrote Broken, the great lesson of that book for me in talking to innovators at scale is that they didn't say, how do we harness this great technology? And then where do we have to have humans? They flipped the question. They always said, what are the most important human relationships, the most impactful human interactions? And let me hold that ground sacred. And then let me use technology to automate and scale the hell out of everything else.
Hmm.
And I think the lesson of that book holds true with AI. We have to and look at lots of different learners, lots of different learner contexts. But for whatever learner we're talking about, in whatever context we're talking about, we're going to have to get really thoughtful about wait a minute, before I start thinking about all the ways I can use agents and AI, what do I want to make sure stays true about human relationship? I don't know if you know Frances Pugh's book, her new book out of Hopkins, sociologist about relational jobs. I think relational jobs are going to be really, really critical. And they may look very, like, I think the role of a faculty member in the future is likely to look very different than it does for many, maybe most faculty members today. Like our reward structure is going to have to start rewarding relationship and not how many papers did you publish, unless you're in a research university. And even
Yeah.
that, I don't know what
Yeah.
that looks like, but right. So I think the role of a physician is going to look different. They are going, they're going to clearly be working with very, very powerful AI diagnostic tools, but you don't want an AI system holding your hand when you've been faced with a terrible diagnosis, right? You want a human being who sees you at that moment and who says, "Hey, Marnie, this is tough. Tell me about the conversation you're going to have tonight when you get home to your family. Tell me about your support system. Tell me about your faith system if you're part of one. Most importantly, tell me how you want me to be at your side as your physician as we go on this journey together." That is such a human set of questions,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
So I think these roles will change. And my feeling is that I'm in the camp and a lot of people disagree, and I hope they're right. But I do think we're going to see massive displacement of white collar jobs and a migration of talent into care economy or relational jobs, healthcare, teaching, counseling. And those are jobs that make the world better. When we do them well, when we support people, they make the world better. But how those jobs play out, what they look like in the future, is going to be really interesting transition to watch. And I think an encouraging one, like a super positive one.
I totally agree with you on that front. So you have a new book coming out. It's called Reclaiming Purpose. And it seems to get right to the heart of this moment that you're describing for us today. What are you arguing higher education needs to reclaim exactly? And what led you to this work now?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It comes out July 21st with Wiley. You can pre-order it now on Barnes& and Noble and Amazon. Sorry, I gotta sort of do
No,
that a
go
little bit.
ahead.
Now that out of the way, you bring us back to kind of where we started, which is the invitation for universities to rise up above what remains important work, which is to prepare people for a world of work. Lots of questions what that's going to look like in the future. And I think it's going to be an invitation to stop thinking about specific jobs, but to think about areas of work, and we can unpack that. But more importantly, I think it's to lift our sights and get back to something which was true of American higher ed prior to the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act was amazing because it democratized learning, right? We had land grant universities open up all over the country. But the purpose was to get higher education focused on the needs of an industrial system, right? Lincoln looked around in 1863 and said, "We are winning this war because of our factories and our railroads and our bridges and our armaments. I need more engineers. I need more technocrats. I need more draftsmen," and so on and so on. So it really became a hugely important historical inflection point around the question of what we teach. And what we started to teach were the things that the workforce needed, what industrialization needed. Prior to 1863, the last class taught on every campus before you graduated, the last class you would take as a graduating senior, would be a class in moral philosophy.
Mm,
Thing that they were doing before they sent you out in the world was to ask that question: what is your purpose? How are you going to navigate this world? How will you give back? And look, at those roots on a European model that had to do with training people for the clergy, and then more broadly in a European tradition of philosophy and so on. But in some ways, that old tradition was about the whole human being. And it was about those questions that I think universities will be asked to. So I think this is going to be an invitation to get back to reclaim an earlier purpose of education. And interestingly, when you look at polls of educators, people who work in higher ed, it's what they all want to do. They want to get at the questions of how do I create better thinkers, more empathetic human beings, people who are civically minded, who have some sense of commitment to the other, right? It isn't just, and I was talking to Steve Levitt of Freakonomics. He teaches at the University of Chicago.
yeah. Yeah.
He's opened up a new school, the Levitt
Mhm.
School. So over on the ASU campus, and he's, asking this question about how do we get back to creating good human beings? And the observation he made to me when we were chatting about this was, I used to have kids in my economics classes at the University of Chicago who talked about making the world better. Now I have kids in my classes that really want to talk about how's the fastest route to becoming a billionaire. And this was echoed in a conversation with Rick Weisbord, who I mentioned earlier, who's doing the stuff on character formation. Had mentioned they did a poll of recent Harvard graduates, and they asked them all these sort of, list the key words you associate with being a graduate of Harvard College. And there were things elite, educated, successful, right? and there were no words that had to do with ethics or morality,
Hmm.
right? And they are both putting their hands or their finger on something I think we all deeply feel, that we're living in a society right now that feels pretty broken and that doesn't feel civic minded, and we're not seeing the commitment to each other and our public institutions and the things that we used to collectively take pride in. And I was struck by this recently in a very sort of personal way. I was visiting my daughter who's clerking. She's a law graduate, and she's clerking for a judge in San Francisco, the Ninth Circuit. And we went into the Ninth Circuit court building, and it was palatial.
Yeah.
And there was this sense of elevation. Remember all those sort of great classical American high schools that were built in the 50s and 60s? They're beautiful buildings. And there's a sense of shared public pride in the common good, and that these things mattered a lot. And I think, we have moved in society to this massive emphasis on the private good. It's part of the crisis in higher ed funding. Um, Starting in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan, we saw this real shift in the notion that education's a private good, so you should just take on as much debt as you need, Marnie. Um, right? And there was a good piece, in, if you remember, a year or two ago, that talked about this, and they singled out the Pesci system, where Dan Greenstein, my good friend, was head Pennsylvania public system, and they used an example of one student at one of the colleges, and it said, 30 years ago, the state would have covered 70% of her tuition, and today it's 100. It's absolutely flipped. So she's racking up all this debt because she now has to account for 70. Why? Well, it's a private good. Um, so I think in some ways, what's exciting about AI is it comes along at a time when society feels pretty broken, and it invites us not simply to kind of fix the thing and get it like, rumbling along again. It's an invitation to reimagine the thing. And even while I think the transition is going to be really hard, I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. We have to find space, and your podcast is a lovely example of this, where we start thinking about what would it look like if it goes bad. We've seen the Terminator movies, but
Mhm.
what does it look like if it goes right? Like, what does it look like if we get it right? What would that look like? And I think
Right.
you captured it beautifully. Like that first generation kid with maybe really compromised circumstances is learning in a way that feels warm and supportive, and they don't feel judged, they don't feel stupid, they don't feel like they don't belong. And they're learning, and that excitement starts to build, and maybe they reclaim that intrinsic, motivation that comes with those small wins as you start to master something. You go, oh, finally. Yeah. So I think there's an exciting future ahead of us.
Well, I totally agree. And I am so honored that you joined us today, Paul. I'm super excited to check out your book. Everybody, please check it out. I think it's definitely worth reading. This topic is really, really interesting. Hard road ahead, but I agree with you. One that is going to lead us to new spaces for education that we couldn't even imagine before.
But
So
thank you, Marnie. Thank you. It's so nice to be in the conversation with you. We've known each other for a long time. You've always been one of the sort of thought partners who are helping really rethink the models and serve more people and serve them better. They deserve it.
to learn more about how institutions are navigating this shift, please visit us at Coursera for Campus. And if you want to go deeper, explore our resources on AI powered learning and skills based education, we'll have lots of resources there for you to check out. And thanks to all of you for joining us on Office Hours, where we have candid conversations for a new era in learning. We'll see you next time.